Africa's leaders are now set to discuss several critical issues at this year's summit. Let's now take a closer look with Babatunde Omilola. He's the head of development planning and inclusive sustainable growth at the United Nations Development Program. Sir, it's an honor to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. My first question is, we often hear about experts saying we need an African solution to an African problem. So AU is such a platform. What do you expect to be the issues that will be addressed this year?
Yes, this year is very remarkable that African leaders are looking into how to tackle corruption on the continent. What we know right now is that in terms of overall corruption, Africa is drained of around $148 billion every year due to corruption. So for us, we are very glad that this is on the agenda because we'll be able to see how we can use some of these resources to finance development on the continent, to deal with issues around poverty reduction, issues around inclusive growth. I also know that this year, the African leaders will be talking about issues surrounding terrorism, about how to create jobs for young people on the continent. But also, more importantly, it's about how we mobilize our own domestic resources on the continent of Africa to finance development. In terms of illicit financial flows, according to the report that President Mbeki has led its preparation, we know that there are about $50 billion that lead the shores of Africa through illicit financial flows every year. So we have to see how all of these resources can stay on the continent of Africa so that we can be able to finance development and reduce poverty and also create job opportunities for young people on the continent. We have a continent of around 1.2 billion people with about 420 young Africans. It's about how we make growth more inclusive on the continent. And I think this is also on the agenda for African leaders to look at. And I think another big item on the agenda is about the institutional reform of the African Union Commission itself and how to reform the organization. But it's also about how to make sure that all the ratifications, all the resolutions, all the protocols that have been agreed upon by African leaders will be followed through and we'll be able to implement them. So implementation is key of all of these reforms on the continent.
You mentioned institutional reforms that does not just limit to the AU, but the African countries themselves. What do you think are the ways out for African countries to spur growth and to bring inclusive growth in the years ahead?
Yes. Well, when you look at what is projected in terms of growth this year for Africa, African countries are likely to grow by 4.1% this year in comparison to 3.6% last year. And also the growth in 2016 was around 2.2%. All of this because of the reduction in commodity prices around the world, which affected many African countries. But in terms of achieving inclusive growth on the continent, I think there are three basic elements to this. One will be how to diversify African economies. And by doing that, it means that growth must not just occur in only one sector or a few sectors. Growth must occur in different sectors across different African countries. The second aspect is that this growth must create employment opportunities for people, particularly young people on the continent of Africa. And the third element is that growth must be sustained for a long period of time so that we'll be able to have inclusive growth. And if we have inclusive growth, that will mean investment in people, especially young people, women, and as well as children. Right. If we don't invest in people, then we also need to look at how to deal with policies and institutions on the continent so that we will be able to implement a lot of policies that are on the continent. And finally, social protection coverage is critical, especially for those who lack access to social protection coverage on the continent. And if we do all of these, we'll be able to spur growth on the continent and we'll be able to employ a lot of young people on the continent.
Babatunde Omilola, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.